go. And we're recording, so that is awesome. We'll have to add that intro back later. Classic. Anyways, Simon, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you go. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. And part of my neighbourhood, because I'm working at home these days, is that a skip has just turned up outside, and it's just one of these lorries to pick up a skip. So if you hear some kind of rumbling, it's the skip collector. But hopefully that noise will fade out. And I've also got a tree being cut down at the back of the house, so I hope you don't get too much noise. I think both things are shortly finished. So yeah, so I have a plan, but it's not much of a plan for how we spend our time together. My plan depends a lot on you and how you want to use this time. So I'm basically, my plan is to talk kind of at you. I don't mind if you throw questions at me as we go, that's great. But I'm kind of on a mission to not talk for too long, even though I prepared, as I said to Rishia, probably far too much stuff. So I've basically created a kind of tour of different innovations in the social care space, some of which I've been deeply involved in, some of which I know something about, but I've been less involved in, but I think are really interesting. And my basic end point, as Rishia's introduction indicated, is I think we're approaching a time where some of us start to need to think how to bring some of this stuff together. That we've been enthusiastically pursuing this solution or that solution for many years, but actually what we need is a more systemic approach, which is rooted in neighbourhoods. So that's the direction of my meandering journey. My goal is to get us there in about 30 minutes and then to open up for discussion. And if Rishia feels like there should be group discussion or wants to frame it anyway, then I'm happy to go with that. I'm very happy to have pushback, questions, clarifications, go back on things I've said, anything like that's fine. So I'm going to try and share my screen. Yeah, it looks like it's going to work. Can you all see that? Is that okay? Okay, so apologies there are far too many slides here. There are a lot of links and things that are very detailed, but you can have all these slides to look at later. So I'll send all of this to Rishia and you can just use it. So don't worry about note taking or anything like that. There are references to books and downloads on the slides as well. So if you're interested in anything particular, you can follow it up. All this stuff is available through the Citizen Network website. Citizen Network actually was dreamed up in Vancouver, so in Canada, in 2015 by me and my friend Kate Fulton, sitting in the Achieving Citizenship conference that was about self-directed support and individualised funding, one of the big global gatherings that Tim Staines had organised from the University of British Columbia. And what we thought was, well, we need to create a kind of global movement to support the ideas of citizenship and inclusion. That there are many good organisations like yours that are organised around them at a local level, but there's not really a way of sharing information at a global level, and there are so many interesting different things we can learn. And also, often the way we do think about inclusion is paradoxically siloed in a world of disability. So it's like we only talk about inclusion inside the world of disability, whereas we all know that inclusion is something that applies everywhere. The idea that everyone's a citizen is about everything in life. So we wanted the opportunity to kind of break down those silos, start connecting people around the world. And that's a lot of what roots my work these days and the talk that I'm giving today. This is my kind of path. So it's a kind of meandering path through institutionalization, deinstitutionalization, local area coordination, personalized support, self-directed support, peer support, self-management, neighborhood democracy, and then it ends with this question of what should our communities really look like? How would we really get these communities functioning in the way we dream of? So I think, well, Rishia and I were just talking before we came on, it sounds like Canada, just like England, this story of institutionalization, deinstitutionalization is an incomplete story, is one way of thinking about it. seems to me that in a way what we've done is moved, especially if you look at the money and how the money is spent in services, we've tended to move from institutions to ghettos, to systems that fund centres and care homes that are now inside communities in a way that institutions were not inside communities, but actually separate people, just as ghettos separate people inside communities. Although many people have made an amazing progress towards inclusion, as a whole, that's not how we support people. This is from looking at English data only, but it gives you a real indication of how far we've got to go, because this just asks the question, where do people with intellectual disabilities live in England now? And if you actually look at all the care homes, the prisons, the group homes, all of the things that, all these care homes and services and places where people are placed that are not really part of people's community, there are actually more people in those kind of modern day institutions than there were in the institutions we closed down. So to me, that's a kind of bit of a sobering fact, and one that's hard to look at. We know, however, that, inspired by the ideas of inclusion and citizenship, many of us have been working hard on a whole range of innovations, and I'm not going to talk about all of these, but I think it's interesting to see how the exciting positive innovations that do make a difference all really tend to be built around values. They're not just some technical change. They're really about people working out how to help people live as citizens and how for us all to be more like citizens. The person who probably inspired me the most is the American thinker and activist John O'Brien, and in his work he talks about citizenship, people who say, I belong to this place and its people, and I'm willing to act from responsibility for my belonging. And the importance here is that I think that's about citizenship is that it's asking the question of what motivates the changes we want to see. It's only really when people actually behave like citizens, who actually say, this is the place that's mine and I have a responsibility for it, that we can see the kind of changes we want to see. In my work, one framework that I developed was this framework called the Keys to Citizenship. Curiously, this framework it came out of a very practical thing, which was I'd spent quite a lot of my life supporting people with very complex disabilities coming out of institutions. It struck me as I was supporting folk, and we designed very individualized support, which I'll talk about briefly later. But it took me that a lot of the things that you needed to know were things really anybody should know. So how to get a home, how to get a job, how to get your income security sorted out, how to get good help. These are kind of ordinary everyday things that had become so professionalized, nobody felt empowered to act on any of them. And so I wrote a book called The Keys to Citizenship, and to really offer people with disabilities and families and social workers practical advice on the things you need to do to offer people good support. But going through that process, it turned into a more philosophical question as well, really. Like, what are we doing? You'll be glad to know the skip is going now. The background noise might slightly improve. But what are we doing, and why are we doing it? When we support people, what's the purpose of it? When we live our life, what's the purpose of it? And I think citizenship is a really good way of thinking about that. I think if you think about these things, they're actually a really good framework for living, for having a good life. They're not a framework that only applies to other people, or to them, or to disabled people, or to disadvantaged people. It's a universal framework. And it's also a framework, although I've had philosophers argue with me about this, but it seems to me is utterly universal and accessible for anybody, however complex their needs, whatever their impairment. Everybody can live a life of meaning. Everybody can be free with the right support. If people are attending, listening, and committed, then people can be free. Everybody can have enough money. And in fact, citizenship is about having enough money, not too little or too much. Everybody can have help and everybody can give help in different ways. Everybody can have a home. Everybody can contribute and have a life. Everybody can experience, give love. These are utterly universal. Disability is no barrier to citizenship. And in fact, many people with disabilities, in my experience, are super citizens if we understand citizenship correctly. So this is kind of like my background framework for the things I'm going to talk about. And I suppose the question that comes out of this for me is, I don't know how it feels to you in Ontario, but I think a lot of good things came out of actually the battle to leave institutions behind us. And it's still quite useful to think about that journey. But I also think we need to start thinking about the world we need to create. For many people in the world today, they don't even know what that whole thing is about. The deinstitutionalization story doesn't mean as much to them. So what is it we're trying to create and give life in our communities? How do we describe that? What's the journey towards? At the same time as I was working on some of these ideas, I was lucky enough to meet people like Eddie Bartnick and Ralph Broad, who have been working around the idea of local area coordination. And I think this is a very useful thing that we should be thinking about. In fact, a few years ago, I don't know if you might not have heard about this scandal in Canada, but in England it was called the Winterbourne View scandal. And we had a documentary team managed to put cameras into a modern day private institution called Winterbourne View. They filmed what was going on. It caused outrage in the general public, and the government, this goes back to now 2011, said, all these places are going to close. We're going to close all of these private institutions. Actually, very little has happened. Lots of money has been spent, but actually the system has carried on much as it has. Doing some work down with friends who are providing personalised support to get people out of institutions, I met some of the families whose children were in Winterbourne View. And what really struck me was that although there were lots of differences between these families, their starting points and their stories, there was a common pattern. The common pattern was that basically the family unit itself was under stress, often because of things that, disadvantages that they faced, which may have included poverty or exclusion or prejudice. The family might be coping for a while, but then there would be a crisis. At the point of crisis, the service system basically only seemed to have one solution, which was to put their son or daughter in a service. At the point at which their son or daughter went into that service, what would happen is that their son or daughter would basically be pissed off. Do you use that expression in Canada? Yeah. So they'd be pissed off. They'd be angry. They'd act out. The system's response to that would be not to figure out why they were pissed off, not to get them back with their family, but to move them further away from their family into a more institutional, more expensive service where they were even more pissed off, and so on and so forth. And the journey from normally a fairly local service centre or whatever the immediate provision was, so these incredibly expensive and damaging institutional placements might have taken several steps, but it always had this kind of pattern. I think local area coordination, there are various things to say about this, but local area coordination is really about trying to avoid this very early on. It's about saying, actually, we need people in our community now. Local area coordinators is the term that was dreamt up in Western Australia in the 1980s. I've had this conversation about, isn't this really community social work? And the local area coordinators push back and say, no, it's not community social work. But it seems very close to really good embedded community social work. And what folk are doing is getting to know people in advance of any crisis, getting to help people think about what kind of solutions they can generate, helping people to connect. I think a lot of the power of the local area coordination process seems to come out of making sure people are more connected sooner and responding to problems that people do have in ways that then build more connections back. So they're always looking for solutions that are connective. Yes, not service solutions. So we published this book about local area coordination a year or so ago, which is full of useful information. You can download it free from Citizen Network or purchase it. But you can see in the model of local area coordination many of the important things that many of us have been thinking about. This is a systemic approach that we know works. And its power seems to lie partially in helping people better, partially in helping people avoid crises, but partially the model is interestingly quite servicey, quite systemy, and that's one of its attractions, I think, for its designers, because it actually helps the wider system think differently. I find this curious but powerfully argued that in a way it's good to have local area coordinators, in a sense, be working for the government or at least closely aligned with powerful system forces, so that those people can represent the community and its real interests back into the system, gathering good information. So that's one, I think, very useful innovation we should be thinking about. Second I'm going to talk about is personalised support. Again, this might be very familiar with you, but in my experience, even good support providers tend to fall a long way short from really offering personalised support. By personalised support, I mean you design every single thing around the individual. You recruit around the individual. The budget is the individual's budget. You design the service with the individual and with their family. You shift power and control over everything you can as close to the person, involving family, friends, community in the decision-making processes. You even can tailor policies and procedures. When we were doing this in Glasgow in the 1990s, instead of writing a kind of health and safety policy or a medications policy that applied to everybody, we wrote a guidebook on how to write good policies, and then every team created the policies that made most sense to that individual. Does that make sense? So lots of things that we do at a kind of organizational level actually can be personalized. Recruitment processes, the staffing arrangements, everything. And I think this is a fantastic way of supporting people well, because usually what goes wrong inside services is to do with the failure to really think through what an individual needs, to instead start saying, well, you might need that, but the organization works like this, and the organization's needs start trumping the individual's needs. And we gathered in this report, there are lots of people around the world, even though this still seems to be a minority sport in service provision, there are lots of people working on with many different groups using this kind of personalized support model. So again, it really intrigues me why we've not been able to make it. It's efficient, it's effective, supports people well, there's lots of data about affordability, but it's still not the norm. We recently published this amazing film about Hattie, who's a woman with paranoid schizophrenia, who had lived in an institution for a long time and is now getting excellent personalised support and is living a beautiful and amazing life. She's still got to live with the schizophrenia, with the voices and the visions and all of the things that can make life challenging. But she's got a boyfriend, she's got a life, she's got good support in the community, she's got a family back together. I'd really recommend that film for anybody who thinks that only some people can live in the community. So I think this is another dimension we need to be thinking about. How do we actually change support so that it really works for people? The thing that's probably taken the biggest chunk of my life is this kind of more what I call self-directed support. Others do sometimes in just individualized funding, personal budgets, all sorts of jargon actually over the years has been around this kind of idea. I think of it as a shift from the professional gift model where power and control is in the hands of the system and in the professionals, and we kind of say, well, this is the service for you. And then when largely you can't change that, and we're moving to a system where instead we say, these are your entitlements. You are a citizen. It's your community. These are your entitlements. We support you to build a good life for yourself. John O'Brien pointed me to some economic literature, which I think is really helpful, which distinguishes push economics from pull economics. I don't know if this is helpful to you, but I found it really good. It was like, if you think about the difference between, as it were, spending the money first and hoping it has a good effect, as opposed to investing in people so that they can not just spend money, but they can use that money in ways that link them to community, which can build on people's gifts, which can work through and with the relationships that people have and strengthen those relationships, which fundamentally are all fired and inspired by the human spirit of the person. That's the difference. Now, in practice, I don't know if in Canada's a bit anywhere like other countries, often when we've shifted systems towards individualized funding or self-directed support, the system has fought back, tried to gain control over people's money, try to say, well, yes, you can have individualized funding, but you can only spend it on this, you can only spend it on that. So again, that part of that battle around the deinstitutionalization, reinstitutionalization process happens in the gubbins, in the very details of how systems are funded. But nevertheless, I think this is important, and it's inspiring when you see people take control. I mean, I met a family. This is a very small experiment in self-directed support, but I just think it was very memorable for me. My friend Suzanne actually acted as a kind of broker for the family. But Mary and Doreen was a woman with learning disabilities who hated going to the respite service. She found it dehumanizing. It was upsetting to her. Her mother didn't like it happening, but she needed some kind of break, so she took it even when her daughter was going there in tears. It was the only thing on offer. And when we said, well, let's take that respite budget and give you control of it, actually Mary's initial response was a little bit timid. It was like, I don't know what I want to do. What would we do with this money? And I think that often happens. You know, it's not clear when you've had these kind of service system relationships. It's not clear what you would do with £3,000. So Suzanne said, well, why don't you just invite friends and family round, and you can talk about it. And so actually, I think that Suzanne helped Mary write some postcards inviting people around for tea. Mary said, oh, nobody will turn up. But that Friday, the house was rammed with people whose basic message was, we've always just been waiting for you to ask. I don't know. Well, this is in Scotland, so it's not an English thing, but it's, you know, and I think, again, that's part of the challenge, isn't it, around community and neighbourliness, is the challenge of asking. But when Mary then opened this question about what should we do, what was amazing was, I mean, they spent the £3,000, but really what they spent it on was just stuff that the family, the friends, co-constructed together, and they just did amazing things. They made that money stretch so far, but they just did fantastic things that they dreamed about and wanted to do, with which all that money was previously spent in a way that made Doreen utterly miserable. So it was just a lovely story. And when we were doing the In Control project, was a project that I set up in England in 2003, and we did piloting around these ideas using the keys to citizenship to gather information. And again, you know, when people have control, they build community. It's not that mysterious, you know, so we need to be shifting control to people, because actually people are the primary agents of their own community, and people start to find better solutions that enable people to live better lives and live as good neighbours or work colleagues or community volunteers or peers. I mean, this process of trying to shift the system towards self-directed support has been going on since 1965, so it's 57 years old, and it's not been quick to adopt these methods. I'm involved in a major European project at the moment to create kind of new standards for self-directed support, and we've got a global project called the SDS network to try and do that too. So we do seem to keep edging forward, but it's slow. So, but as I say, I think it's essential to what we're talking about, because if you can't do everything for people. People need have the right and the power that comes from doing things for themselves, with their family, in their own way. The fourth thing I want to talk about is peer support. I was like, at a personal level, because I gave so much of my life to developing models of self-directed support, I'm always a little bit disappointed in myself that I didn't really fully fathom the importance of peer support in those systems. And I think had I had my time again, I would have perhaps done things differently, because since moving on in a way, partially because I upset too many people in England and had to move on, but certainly my career changed radically in 2009, and I worked with various different new social innovations. The thing that gives me the most joy is working around peer support. The thing that inspires me almost every day is working with my friends in Doncaster in this organisation called PFG Doncaster. It's just amazing what they do. There's 2,000 people in this group, and they're not, most of them are not paid. All of them really are people who the system historically has stuck labels on. You've got a mental health problem, you've got a disability, you can't cope, you're disadvantaged, you're poor. Some people, who've been in sex work, people who've been drug abusers, all of these kind of negative labels that can stick to people and damage their lives. And what this group has done is just flip the tables on the whole thing, I think. They've said, well, we can help each other. And we've written several reports about this work and its power, so I'm just touching on it here. But again, one of the things that's really interesting is that the group is kind of almost endlessly creative, because it's building things around the gifts and needs of all its members. If there's somebody who's feeling in need of something, there's usually somebody who wants to do something, who wants to give something. And so what a lot of the group is doing is really kind of aligning those things. A lot of it, when they began, there was a kind of exploration of what is sometimes called time banking, where people say, well, I did so many hours to support Jack, or I did so many hours to support Mary, or actually that all dissolved into a fuzzier concept that they just call support buddies, which is just helping each other out. So if somebody needs help, then PFG tries to figure out who can help you. And it doesn't try to count or say some people are in credit as opposed to other people. Because that is, I think the kind of time banking concept, while it has many positives, it worries me that it's a bit neoliberal in the end. That it's all about exchange and having credit and debit, and actually getting help is a form of giving help. I think what's interesting about BFG is getting help and being able to give help and being able to swap roles actually is a form of solidarity and empowerment, because you start to see yourself as a citizen. You start to not be embarrassed about the things you need help with, and you start to recognize you have gifts also that you can help others with. Counting things doesn't really help in that sense. The fact that you might need help to go to the opticians and somebody comes and helps you, well, the person helping you is probably feeling quite good that they can help you. Do we count their help as a positive or a negative? Do you see what I mean? It's not helpful. And so, I could go on and on about this group, but the amazing thing about it at one level is how efficient it is, because really what they're doing is things that the service system, if it spent money on it, would be costing millions and millions of pounds. but people are doing it basically from love, from solidarity, from community. In the early days, PFG had, was too challenging for the system, and people were very suspicious of it in the system. But now the system started to wake up to how powerful this is and is starting to invest in it. So it's growing in lots and lots of interesting ways. And now PFG provides a really high quality peer support crisis service as part of our own National Health Service. So it's really powerful. So, and as I say, so peer support to me is essential. I think it's so dignifying at so many different levels. Actually, before we got started, Rishi was telling me about Buurtzorg in the Netherlands, which is a really exciting innovation. But I've kind of included it, but not Buurtzorg. But I was going to talk about what Buurtzorg does, which means neighbourhood care in Dutch. And they are the best known international example of this. But this concept of organising support at a neighbourhood level with teams who are rooted in that neighbourhood, who are organised as a small team who can make their own decisions, stripping away hierarchy, stripping away cost, allowing resources to be invested in the frontline staff, district nurses, social workers, community nurses, typically in Buurtzorg, has been tremendously successful in the Netherlands, and there are examples of it popping up all over the place. My friends in Australia, Kate, in fact, who I mentioned earlier because she helped dream up Citizen Network in 2015, started to think about the logic of applying this in a support service, a very large support service in Western Australia called Avivo. But the other thing they were thinking about was how to apply the keys to citizenship that I mentioned earlier to staff. I think this is such a really good question to ask, and again, I think it's one of the problems actually in self-directed support is sometimes the staff element, the support element becomes kind of pushed down, like the staff are just there to do what people tell them. It used to be the bosses that bossed you around, and now it's other people bossing you around. But is that a good model? Don't we want everybody to be a citizen? So, what Kate and her team did in Australia is start exploring how to create the conditions for citizenship inside the organisation. So a lot of this has a lot of similarities with Buurtzorg, but I think in many ways they're applying it to staff groups that Buurtzorg doesn't cover, to support staff, home care staff, and people that actually are not normally in the Buurtzorg model. And even applying that model of self-management, of trying to reduce, in the challenge in Australia is big funding pressures. What Avivo wanted to do was make sure that the money went to the frontline staff, not the management. So it's basically disinvesting from management, putting resources and capacity and power in the hands of frontline staff. And to do that, it turns out you have to organise on a neighbourhood basis. You have to cut out all the travel, you have to cut out all the hierarchy, you have to cut out all the confusion. I'm sorry, you do have a bit of noisy background soaring here. Hopefully this is finished soon. It's very interesting, I think. I think this has got to be part of the solution going forward. Now, I'm nearly getting to the end. You'll be glad to know. The other thing that as Citizen Network developed, I think one of the things we're just interested in is how does power operate anyway? Why do so many communities themselves not feel powerful? During the pandemic, we started to meet together, many of us connected to Cormac Russell, and start to ask the question, how should communities be organised? And out of that emerged the neighbourhood democracy movement, which it's only 2 years old, so it's a baby thing that we're working on at the moment, but I think it's very exciting. It's got some amazing people involved. I put a link there to some talks, which include a talk by Annabelle McFadden about Froome. And Froome is a very interesting example of this, probably the best developed in England anyway that I know about, where a community really has started to come together to think about how to take care of each other better as a community. And Annabelle talks through that in the film, and I won't rehearse all the details, but essentially it's almost breaking things down street by street, block by block, making sure that there's elements of leadership so that things get picked up. But the other thing that's interesting about Froome had in fact, Annabelle's husband, Peter McFadden, was at the heart of leading a kind of rebellion in civic governance. Froome's, I don't want to bore you with the complexity of English local government, but we have some things called parish councils and some things called town councils, which are usually very low level, really don't have any significant power, and usually very little involvement. And what Peter organised in Froome was a takeover of the town council by the citizens. And he calls this the flat pack democracy movement. And this slide comes from a campaign they did to try and extend this. I mean, it's been challenging to extend it, but what they did in Froome is amazing. What they did was kick out party politics. So what we would end up with, in what we have a lot in England, is you have these kind of tin pot civic structures, and then you still got people saying, well, I'm Labour, or I'm Conservative, or I'm Liberal, and people voting on a party ticket. Hardly anybody votes. And then people come along and go through kind of really shallow civic governance, just party politics, stupidity, messing around. So what they did was apply really democratic principles. Basically, they sat around in a pub, created a model where people would be independent councillors, people would go on rotation, all the real decisions would be made through deliberative democracy that everybody was involved in, and then they used the town council to basically push through things that the council wanted to do together. I think this is fascinating. I'm not saying it's easy, but you can see here that how important democracy is to a lot of the things that we are talking about, isn't it? It's okay to say, well, we want this innovation or that innovation, or this is a nice way of working. But the value of democracy is it kind of underwrites it all. It provides the security and guarantees we need to make sure this stuff happens. When stuff doesn't happen, then there's a way in which you can adjust and you can say, oh, hang on, well, we need to change what we're doing. So I think that there has to be a kind of democratic bedrock to some of this. And so in the neighbourhood democracy movement, the kind of way we think about this is to think about democracy as being something that needs to be deep. It needs to have different layers to it. That we think about neighbourhood democracy as really the kind of topsoil. So all the gardeners in the room know what I mean. It's not impossible to grow things with no good topsoil, but what you tend to get are things like pine trees. Like you get, you can grow things and they can draw down resources or can suck up, but if you really want to grow a fertile, interesting, diverse community, then you need good topsoil. And the good topsoil, in democratic terms, in neighbourhood terms, are the structures that enable people to meet, to talk, to discuss things, to decide things, to move resources around, to say, let's do this instead of that. If you don't have that, you're basically reliant on just other random forces deeper down. And the negative impact of that is that things are just not going to be as flourishing. Of course, we still need good public services. We need good civil society organisations. We need tax and benefits, and I would argue basic income. We need all the deeper things as well. So it's not kind of throwing the bottom away. And part of the reason we're using this kind of model is that actually in England, again, I don't know if this is the same in Canada, but in England, the government has sometimes said, oh, you need lots more community so that we can cut services, so that we can cut benefits. And we're going, no, 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 no. We need community so we can have more of those good things, not fewer of them. We need community so that we can live better lives, we can flourish. And for that, we also need secure public services, and we need social justice, and we need a good democratic system and good systems of devolution. Yeah. But you've got to see it systemically. Okay, I'm nearly finished. I'm really feeling for you here. Um, but um, but so that's what when we talk about neighborhood democracy, this is not so much like there are lots of good models. Froome is a really interesting model, but we're really, I think, in a process of exploring what the models look like. And there are models from overseas and India and South America that we're interested in. I think the more we can connect globally around this idea, some people call this, I think, also sociocracy, but finding these ways where we can meet, talk, decide together seems pretty important. So this is just my final chunk, and this is my kind of proposition or question or what next section, really. So we have these models, and we could add models. I mean, this isn't a full list, but these are the ones that have been particularly important in my life in one way or other. But how do we create a sustainable ecosystem or bigger system out of these models? And how do we address, I think, two fundamental issues at least. One is sustainability. How do we create this in a way that sustains itself? So it doesn't just become something that's a good idea, but nobody has the resources or energy to put anything into. That actually instead it becomes something that in a way grows more fertility in the ground. How do we do that? And the other thing is really interesting questions about justice, which we've touched on. Like how do we protect disability rights and shift power and control to people with disabilities, people with mental health needs, people who are otherwise disadvantaged? But how do we also protect the rights of staff, frontline staff, people on low incomes very often, people with precarious work, very insecure incomes? And what are the universal systems? What are we doing to support everybody better? One thing I'm interested in is this idea of how do we go upstream? So I think if you think about how we end, in one of my first slides where I was talking about the drift downstream to institutional responses, then I think we need to start thinking much more about what the upstream pathway looks like. What are the upstream solutions? How do we invest energy and time and attention in nature, in society, in community, in family, and in citizenship itself? These are things that can stop the rot. How do we actually move resources out of these broken systems? Because if you keep building institutional services, then there's a gravitational force, isn't there, that draws money and power and attention down anyway. So there's still huge kind of systemic challenges like that to face. Citizen Network is one of the founders of the UBILAB Network, which is a campaigning organisation for basic income. There are 45 labs now, several outside UK, in Iceland and Washington DC and Jakarta and Finland and other places, Buenos Aires. So there's a global movement for actually saying, don't we all need security? At least at a basic level, we all need to know that we're okay. And can't we provide that to each other? And if you did provide that to each other, how would you change people's relationship to community? Wouldn't you release lots of potential capacity? That's what the data seems to suggest. People sometimes with a basic income choose to carry on working, but they're much fussier about what kind of work they do. Some people choose to put their time and energy into their families, into learning new skills, and into the community. That's what you'd expect security to do, is actually strengthen citizenship. And this is my crazy last slide. I think it's kind of my last slide. So this is where my head is at now. This is an unresolved slide, and I've thrown English data at it. But, I'm curious when you think about what we call in England social care, which covers disability services, covers support for young children, older people, all disability groups. And you think about a neighbourhood as about 5,000 people, then you start to realise, well, actually, we're currently spending quite a lot of money at that neighbourhood level. It just never appears in the scope of the neighbourhood. You realise that the number of people with significant disabilities in that community of 5,000 is not massive. It's maybe 150 people with significant support needs, and then there'll probably be other people with some support needs. When you think about the peer support work, but you also realise all those people, even if they've got support needs, are also full of talent and full of gifts, but we're not probably really organised to help release any of those things. In England, none of our service systems really relate to neighbourhoods, and they're all just a crazy patchwork, all at a higher level. But the closest, curiously, in our system is the primary school. The primary school is quite well correlated with neighbourhoods generally. So why aren't we working with primary schools, really, would be a question. In fact, we know from Finland that where they've linked primary schools and nursing homes together so that actually older people and young people just eat together. That seems super cool to me. If you are going to have a nursing home, make sure it's in your neighbourhood and nobody has to leave the neighbourhood, and make sure it's linked to the primary school. That would be a really cool way of grounding our conversations about birth and life and death and the interconnection of generations. But yeah, why are our other systems really so distant from the neighbourhoods that have got to be the key to creating good solutions? And then one of the other questions, and when we're in that service space, we might be a service provider, or we might be an expert organisation, we might be something like a community living organisation. What is our offer or our relationship with those neighbourhoods? Can we reimagine what that would look like? Seems to me a lot of it might be less about providing services and more about providing information, more helping people with skills, more helping people learn from the experiences that they're having, more facilitative, more communicative, more informative, less doing. And therefore, is there a journey for many charities and organisations into a different space that's much more actually kind of social educational and much less interventional? So, final slide really is just an invitation for anybody and everybody to join us. It's free to join Citizen Network, and we've now just set up the co-op mechanism, which also we're having organisations come on as co-op members, and individuals will be able to come on as co-op members a little bit later, but that's probably for another day. I didn't hit half an hour. Sorry. 45 minutes maybe.
You did great. Just close, just over 50, but that's okay. And
Okay.
Simon, we're riveted, and we still have time to talk. Lots of I've been writing questions down as we go, but you all may have questions. So I guess what I'd like to do is actually put us into some small groups. So there are, I should probably, there are people here in the room with me, just so folks online know. There is a group of us gathered, so we're doing a truly hybrid sort of event today. I think I'd like to that was a lot to reflect on, and my brain is sort of exploding a little bit, but I want to send us into some small groups here, and I'm going to try and put us in groups of 3. I'm going to attempt my breakout room, and I first just want to ask you in 3 minutes each in your groups to take the time just to say, like, wow, what's resonating for you? I'm looking around at who's online, and I know who's in the room. We've got folks from developmental services, service providers. We have citizens from neighborhood associations. I see Megan, shout out to Megan from the city of Brantford here. And yeah, just Brigida, I see you there. So lots of great folks, a real mix of people. So I'd like you to, in your small groups, consider just like what was resonating for you. And I'm going to bring that back. And then I think we're going to dig into that a little bit. So what was resonating for you? And I'd like, you know, if that's too vague for you, I'd like you to consider, of all the things that Simon said, what feels like, where are the possibilities for you in shifting? There was a lot there about, and for those of us who were here yesterday around asset-based community development with Joe, I heard a lot of the same language around gifts in neighborhoods. So what was resonating for you in that talk, and what is feeling possible right now? So I'd like to present you with that question. We'll bring it back, and then Simon will be with us, and we'll bring those things back. And then if you've got additional questions for Simon that are coming out of that, maybe we'll have a larger group conversation. So we're going to take 9 minutes. So groups of 3 minutes each to talk. And